This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partner Paul Weiss and contributing partners National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to This Week in the Boardroom. I'm Scott Cutler, Executive Vice President with NYSE Euronext, and today I'm joined by Steve Miller, Chairman of AIG, known as the Turnaround Kid, and also CEO of Hawker Beechcraft. Steve,
Correct.
It's a real pleasure to have you in here, really talking about the tackling the challenges of turnarounds. I don't think the viewers really need to be recited all of the recent corporate history with AIG, but I think it's important to note that you joined the board back in 2009 as the board was being changed. Started with six new directors. There's been a few CEOs that have changed since that time.
Directors.
Directors, that's right. And we've gone through, or you're going through, a process of recapitalization and really turning the company around. There's been so much media focus and attention and coverage around this, but our really interest is understanding from a board of directors perspective. And I guess really my first question is, can you share with us, what was that first board meeting like?
Well, the first board meeting I went to was at a time when the company not only was perhaps the most hated symbol of capitalism in America because of the disaster that had befallen it, but it was a company that was in liquidation. The objective was to try and break it up into pieces, sell off the pieces. There was not a hope that it would add up to the amount of money the government had invested in us, but the idea was to have as elegant a funeral as we could have, I would say. In addition, we were concerned about retaining people because even at their homes they would have protesters show up and threaten their children and everything. And just trying to keep the business going during that time was enormously difficult. So who would go on a board like that? Well, basically, it's either people like me who aren't afraid of very difficult business scenarios, or people with just a very heightened sense of public service. The board that we assembled has been incredibly skilled, particularly in the financial arena, able to deal with this.
And as you look about that challenge of coming into a situation like that, what are the ground rules that you establish as a board in terms of putting structure around driving strategy, working with the management team, and setting some foundational elements to execute a turnaround? Yeah.
Well, the job of the board, basically, there are two things that are really important for a board. One is getting a appropriate strategy in place, and secondly, getting a leadership in place that can execute that strategy. If you do those two things right, everything else will take care of itself. About a month after I got there, we did hire a new CEO. It was like the fourth or fifth CEO over a 3 or 4 or 5 year period, and it was Bob Ben-Maché. And he had previously been the chairman and CEO at MetLife, so he knew the insurance business. He'd been retired, decided that retirement wasn't as great as it's cracked up to be, and he was anxious to take on this also as a public service. The important thing was, in the first meeting he came to, he said, okay, I understand your strategy is liquidation, but is it okay if I review the strategy, because I think there's a lot of value here, and if we keep this company intact, we can create value enormously. Nobody at that time ever dreamed we'd ever be able to do well enough to return the amount of investment the government had put into AIG. But now it's very clear that not only are we going to pay back every penny the taxpayers invested in AIG, but at a significant profit to the taxpayers.
Yeah, with the government as a shareholder, is the relationship between them as a shareholder different than any other shareholders?
Well, I would say this, to their credit, The United States Treasury oversaw the process with a search firm of identifying directors to come in. But once they had signed off on this new board and the new slate of directors, they stepped back and said, you are responsible for the business. You understand the objectives, the overall objectives we have, but we're not going to second guess your decisions. Now, having said that, we had representatives of the Federal Reserve until we finished paying them off, and to this day, representatives of the Treasury who would come and sit through most of our board and committee meetings so that they could understand what was going on. But they are very respectful of what the board and management are doing. We will sometimes ask them, how do you feel about this or that? But basically they will say, it's your call as a board. We expect you to run this company, and win or lose, it's your responsibility, and you're not going to be able to say that the government made you do this or that. So they are, other than the fact that they're often in the room, that makes them a little different from your average shareholder, but they are extremely respectful of the board. They picked a good board, and the board has delivered.
We have a lot of great examples in terms of situations where companies have felt the gravitational pull of a death spiral and have come out of that successfully. From a board perspective, in your experience, turning companies around, what role does the board play as a company may be entering into that potential death spiral or very difficult circumstances in terms of the ability to use the board to really turn the ship around, and how does the board execute on that?
Well, the first question any board should have in a troubled situation is whether you've got the appropriate leadership in place. And sometimes that means you have to change out the CEO. And it's not necessarily that the former CEO is a bad person, but sometimes in adversity, they are not the right person to lead a company in adversity. I've seen CEOs who've been wonderful leaders in a successful period when it's growing, and then terrible leaders when the thing starts to go downhill. So you not only have to have the right person as CEO, but it has to be the right person for the challenge that's immediately ahead. So leadership is, far and away number one. Secondly, a board has to be able to make decisions efficiently, because if you just want to study everything to death and say, let's have more consultants, let's have another study, and we'll think about it again, next month or the next quarter, then you're going to continue that downward spiral. The other thing I would say, sometimes boards can be at fault for letting a company get into trouble, and that would be in cases where the board is not close enough to what's really going on. I was on a board once where we were having trouble, so we actually fired the CEO. I was put in as the interim CEO, and the first thing I did the day that I got put in was to call our top 10 customers and to tell them that not to worry, we're going to continue the same fine service that the old CEO had always bragged about in the boardroom.
Right.
My customers said, please don't do that. We don't trust you. We don't think you're reliable. We're totally confused by you. Please change. And that was a wake-up call to me. What was I doing as a board member if I didn't know there was that much discontent at the customer base? I should have, done my own contacts among our customers to find out how is our company doing. And so that's one thing. Another company where I came in the aftermath of a crash, it was one where the board had only met once a quarter. They went to resort locations. They never got to talk to the other executives of the company other than the CEO, so they had only one person telling them how great things were, and then when it crashed, everybody was shocked and surprised. And also in that case, none of them were experts in the industry that company was in. So you need in your board to have a mix of people who understand the basic industry they're participating in. You need a board that's proactive, going out, talking to regulators or customers or suppliers or investors, say, what do you like and not like about this company, so that you, when you're in the boardroom, can give more effective guidance.
So you bring up a really important, and maybe it's a subtle point as well, as though you have to have a board that is comprised of the right individuals and the right composition. How do you make the effective changes on a board when a board may not be actually at the wheel where they should?
Well, you need at least some people on the board who are interested in, do we have a good enough board? And I would say boards have gotten a lot better in the last 10 or 20 years. I mean, when I first started doing board service a couple decades ago, the board was made up of people that the CEO selected, friends, and it was very clubby. And today, boards are almost entirely selected through a formal process where you select a search firm to identify people. You've already done a skill set assessment of what kind of board members do we have, what are the holes here, what do we need for our next board member, and you therefore get a much more independent board that understands they are in charge of this company and responsible to the owners for the success of the company. And yes, you're friends with the CEO, you're supportive of the CEO, but you've also got that independence of judgment. And one of the 15 years ago or so, it was unheard of to have a meeting of the independent directors by themselves without management. Today it is de rigueur. Every board meeting has an executive session at the conclusion, so that are there any issues here that need to be brought out? Are there things we should be talking about? Are there things we should be concerned about? Don't leave them underneath the covers. Bring them out. Let's talk about them and deal with them.
My last question is really the state of governance. We have a lot of different changes in regulation, regulatory oversight. We have a big push by shareholders to have a lot more transparency in the board. What specifically makes you bullish about the current state of governance here in the U.S., and what gives you concern?
Well, the bullishness I would have is largely based on the fact that board members care deeply about their own reputation, and whenever they see another company get into trouble where the board is criticized, you think, could that happen to me? Will I be criticized for something I am missing here? That's the good news. The bad news on many fronts is what I would call one. This goes back to Sarbanes-Oxley. High-minded effort to make sure boards really pay attention to what they say in their accounted statements about what happened yesterday. But so much goes into compliance and making sure that the 10K, you got to read all 200 pages of it and make sure that it's totally accurate, the commas are in the right place and all that, that sometimes it saps too much of the energy of the board from doing what I think is the principal board job, which is, do we have the right strategy? Do we have the right management to execute the strategy? Another factor is what I would call in some way the politicization of the boardroom itself. There's a lot of efforts by people who have specific agenda not related to the shareholder enhancement, if you will, in share price terms, but rather these are social objectives. I mean, save the whales or something else that has very little to do with the business of the company, but is an important objective to that person. And they're finding more and more ways to get into the boardroom and try and push their, I would call it, non-economic agenda into the boardroom. And if you do enough of threatening board members with adverse publicity and criticism and all that, you're going to make it an unfriendly place to be. And I think perhaps the quality of board members who will want to take that abuse, may go down. So we may be hurting our whole, century-long public ownership of our corporations by making board service, more onerous, more difficult, more bogged down in compliance matters rather than forward-looking creativity. I'm concerned about that, and it also, I think, has been coincident with the steady rise in the percentage of our businesses that are in private equity, where you don't have to put up with all those rules.
Yeah. Well, listen, in 13 minutes of time, you've given the reader, or our viewers here, some really important advice. focusing on strategic direction, making sure that you have the right management team, and you've covered a spectrum of things, everything from board performance and management performance to composition that certainly I think we found very valuable today. So Steve, thank you for participating in the show.
Well, Scott, thank you for having me. I appreciated being here.
Well, we hope you'll tune in next time to cover another important topic to make you a more successful director or committee member. Thank you.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partner Paul Weiss and contributing partners National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.